I feel like so many other black people feel. I feel vulnerable. I feel susceptible. I feel more in danger with every killing, than I've ever felt. I mean, I really feel it.
Many people have to have what we now know as the conversation with their children in order to make sure they come home. So it's central to our experiences in this country.
That very phenomenon of needing it to be as grotesque as possible, as violent as possible, to care about Black life is something I think I'm aware of and understand.
But it started with police violence in the sense of catching former slaves, the policing of Black bodies. So there's been this ongoing infatuation with Black death. We have to find a new way in which to find justice for Black people who are killed.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright. Welcome to the show, and a special welcome to everybody in the Lexington, Kentucky area, which is joining us for the first time this week. Glad to have you all in the community. This week, we are processing a crushingly familiar story in Memphis, Tennessee. Officers from a special anti-crime unit of the Memphis Police Department stopped 29-year-old Tyre Nichols on January 7th. It's still unclear on what grounds he was stopped in the first place. The officers threw him to the ground and may have even tased him as he asked why he was being stopped. And when he broke free and ran, a group of officers chased him down and brutally beat him for several minutes. He died in the hospital 3 days later. The police department released graphic video of the beating on Friday, setting off a fresh round of national news and protests over the state-sanctioned killing of yet another Black American. And in my 25 years of journalism, I have no idea how many times I've had cause to repeat almost everything I just said. It is a crushingly familiar story. And still, we need to talk about a specific human life lost and a specific community confronting the aftermath. So to help us process this story, I'm joined by Karanja Ajanaku. He's the executive editor of the new Tri-State Defender, a news organization serving the Black community in Memphis. He also spent many years covering both City Hall and Black life in general in the city for the Commercial Appeal. And Karanja, thanks so much for making time. I know you got a lot going on there.
Kai, it's my pleasure.
So to be fair, there are a couple of key differences in the details of this particular case. One thing that's different in the public conversation, at least about it, is the fact that all 5 police officers involved in the beating of Tyre Nichols are Black. Many have had much to say about this fact, but for you, how does the race of the officers matter or not in this case?
Well, I think I'll just go to what Ben Crump said at one of the press conferences, that they have found in dealing with these excessive force cases that it is not the race and ethnicity of the officer as much as it is the race and ethnicity of the victims.
Yeah, Ben Crump, who is now the attorney for the family, for the Nichols family, and of course, whose name will be known to many as someone who has been attorney in many of these cases around the country.
I think it's also important to note, though, that while 5 officers have been charged and fired and charged, when you see the video, I'm sure you have, there are a lot more officers there. They're not all African American. And one of the things that certainly the street level protesters are saying is, well, hey, what about the other officers? Or what particularly about the European American officer that you see there? And then we recently found that there are 2 sheriff's deputies, and we don't know what the ethnicity of those are.
That there are more people involved in this moment.
Yes, and they've said there would be ongoing investigations, but whoa, when you saw it and you could actually see how many more there were, it's like you can understand why there's such an energy from people to say, hey, we want to know the names of everybody, and we want action, and we want it now.
Well, I mean, another important distinction for this case is what has happened since Tyre Nichols died, at least relative to national conversation about this. The officers have been fired and charged with crimes, those 5 at least. And there is an investigation into why he doesn't appear to have received appropriate medical attention after the beating. So the response, at least as far as it has gone from the city in terms of holding officers accountable, has been more swift than in previous cases around the country when we've had this conversation. And so I guess my question for you is that unexpected in Memphis to you, that it would be that as much as has happened, or is that, what do you make of what has happened so far and the speed with which it's happened?
Sure. I think the first thing is to note that Mr. Crump again said that the way that it has proceeded relative to the swiftness within 20 days is a blueprint for America, right? That he's not seen anything like that in any of these other cases. So then why is that? How did that come to be? Well, in part, you like to think that you would have learned something over time, but I think particularly here, we have a new district attorney. Just came into office a few months ago, and there was, on the campaign trail, he promised that he would move swiftly relative to these types of cases. The previous district attorney was more on the quote conservative side. Mm-hmm. And so there was an expectation, certainly on the part of the African-American community, that they would see a different type of action from the DA's office. And then I think too, there was just the severity of it. It was having the video there made a difference. This is not the first time that an unarmed African-American man has been killed in Memphis in an encounter with the police. In 2015, I believe it was, Darius Stewart was stopped. He was, I think, a passenger in a car, and there was an encounter, and he was killed. There were protests, and so and nothing happened in terms of to the officer. I think the officer actually took some type of pension. I think he gets like $2,300 a month plus 70% of his health benefits for the rest of his life. And so that all was there. But again, with this new district attorney coming in, and so much of the African American community backed him, there was an expectation that something different was going to happen. And I think too that we had a police chief, relatively new police chief, Chief Sherilyn Davis. She's African American. So I think you put those two factors together, there was some expectation that there would be something different. But 20 days within the incident, I think, was a surprise for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. And I hear you saying that protesters on the street are asking for what about everybody else involved, but is there a sense, do you get a sense from the community that what has happened thus far, people are like, okay, I applause to these new leaders for doing it right? Or how have they been received? How have these
well, different elements in the community, see it differently. There are some who are saying, yes, we do applaud that. There are certainly different other people saying, well, no, yeah, we see what you've done there, but there is a lack of transparency. Why didn't we know about these officers earlier? And so it depends on who you're talking to.
Right. You mentioned the video. One of the very familiar parts of this case is the video and its role as a catalyst for public attention to the case. We have talked on this show in previous cases about the kind of weird role these videos now play in American culture. That, on the one hand, they, are this remarkable tool for establishing the truth, for bearing witness, as you pointed out, that no doubt was part of the energy of getting what accountability we've gotten so far in this case. On the other hand, I have not watched the video. I quit watching them a very long time ago. Unfortunately, I can refer to them as them. And that's regardless of the fact that it's actually my job to watch them. I just won't do it. And I'm disturbed by the way they live in our media. And That's me, and I genuinely struggle with what to think and feel about them. And I guess I just wonder about in this particular case, as someone who's thought so much about Memphis and Black Memphis in general, how do you feel about this video and its role? Just help me think that through.
Well, two things. You have the body cam footage, and then you have the sky cop footage. I think if you did not have the sky cop footage, we might be in a little different situation. The body cam shows some things, but that sky cop shows a whole nother level. I mean, there's just no mistaking on what happened there.
This is the surveillance video. This is a police
Mm-hmm.
surveillance camera that's mounted on a pole in some parts of the city.
It was actually put in place by the county commission because there was, concern, a surge in the area. And as one of the attorneys for the family, who was a former county commissioner, was saying that while we put it up there to catch crime, and now we're catching the police doing the crime, there was not that type of footage available, as I said, when in 2015, when Darius Stewart was killed by the police, and so that makes a difference. I understand what you're saying about not seeing it. I really do. I mean, we're a small staff here, but one of the main reporter that I had, she couldn't watch it. She just asked me, please don't make me cover that, and so. Yeah, I understand it, and so I jumped in to do that. So people are going through all sorts of things like that, trying to process it, So, but somebody's got to watch it, you've got to watch it and then react and respond appropriately. I mean, that's not so much in terms of how people react out in the street, stuff like that. I mean, getting something done, that's the thing. We don't want to keep being where we are, and so if the footage then is going to allow us to get to policy change, serious systemic change, then that's what we got to do.
So you told her, don't worry about it. You don't have to watch it. I'll take over.
No, I had to, because I'm not into, hey, no, I understand it, so that's my job, to fill in the gap.
How did you take it in when you watched it?
I have children. I could hear myself just like that, they're just holding the guy, and this guy just reaches back like a wrestling thing, and just over and over again, you can feel the breath come out of you, but in my case, my job is to watch it, because I've got to be able to tell my readers what I saw, and to put them in a position to be able to process it and to take whatever next steps that make sense for them in terms of getting where we need to get.
I'm talking with Karanja Ajanaku, executive editor of the New Tri-State Defender, a news organization serving the Memphis area Black community. We can also take your questions for Karanja about Memphis, about this awful story. Call us at 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. Stay with us. It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright, and I'm talking with Karanja Ajanaku, editor of the New Tri-State Defender, which is a news organization serving the Black community in Memphis. We are talking about the awful story of the police killing of Tyre Nichols. We can also take your questions for Karanja about Memphis, about this awful story, whatever you've got on your mind. You can call us at 844-745-TALK. That's 844-745-8255. Or if you're watching on YouTube, just drop it in the chat. And Karanja, you've been covering the story from its beginning. It did not start this weekend when the video became public. So can you introduce us to Tyre Nichols? I mean, what have you reported about his life?
Well, I think the best version of who he is comes from his mother. And boy, the heart goes out for her being in front of the national media so many times and having to talk about her son under these circumstances. But he was 29 years old. He worked at the FedEx hub with his stepfather, whom they just said is his father. They were that close. He loved photography. He particularly loved skateboarding, and he loved taking photos of sunsets. He was off that weekend, and his mom said that her name's Robon Wells, that he was coming back from one of those sunset adventures when this happened. She said that, every mother says that, hey, they've got a good son, but as she said that he wasn't perfect, but as she said, damn near. And she said that he had a tattoo of her on his arm. And she said, sons don't normally do that, but she said that he loved her dearly, that he was just the kind of guy that you can't seem to find anybody that said this guy was a difficult personality. In fact, just the opposite. He would meet often with some friends up at Starbucks. He was a very sociable kind of a gentleman. It's worth noting that he had Crohn's disease, and amongst the things that does, it affects your weight. And so they said that he weighed really about, or just a little less than 150 pounds, as they said, quote, soaking wet, which made this brutal situation just that much more. That 5 people are beating up this gentleman who, by all accounts, is the kind of personality that you would want your son to have and to demonstrate.
I mean, whoever you are, 5-on-1, it's just basic stuff. I mean, before we get to any of the rest of it, how are 5 people beating up one person? It's not surprising the outcome. What I said earlier, that it's not clear yet why he was stopped in the first place. I mean, what has the Memphis Police Department said, or the city said, about why they were bothering him in the first place?
Well, you have to go back to this now disbanded Scorpion unit, and it's one of these special units that the new police chief put in place about 5 months after she came in. I think she came in 2021, and there had been concern, and there is concern about a surge in crime, and so this unit was put in place to do that. She says that there is evidence that it had been doing its job. It's gotten bad actors off the street. It's got a lot of guns. But what we know now, at least certainly from listening to Mr. Crump and those folks, is that there have been a number of people in the community that are saying that this basically was a rogue unit built on essentially domestic terrorism in terms of how it was going about its business. And I think Attorney Antonio Romanucci was saying that you can call it whatever you want, Scorpion unit or whatever, but he said it's one of these saturation units, and they tend to be oppression units, and they focus in on so-called Black and brown children, and they just went amiss. It's interesting too that our police chief here at one point served in Atlanta, and she was over a similar type of operation. I think they called it Red Dog there. And it also eventually ran into some criticism about how the officers were really going about the same type of aggressive behavior here. And I think it was eventually disbanded.
You just to get a little more backstory about this unit, because I'd like to understand how it came to be in the first place. Now, this is again, it's the unit is called Scorpion. We have heard time and time again in cities across the country and throughout history that these are the units where there's so often excessive force comes out of it. It's worth noting that you interviewed the police chief. She told you they were never going to disband it. And then a couple of days later, they did, in fact, disband it. So it has now been disbanded.
I wouldn't say that she said never, but it was obvious at that point when our reporter talked to her that she didn't think that was the way to go. She thought it was too much of a reaction to bad actors. But there was such a pushback in the community on multiple levels that she changed course in 24 hours. She met with the members of the Scorpion unit, and they agreed that they weren't going to go forward. I think Mr. Romanucci really put it into context, is that given what has happened and our ability to see it, how is it that anybody in the community could ever trust that unit? It was basically defunct, and so I think so many people got to her, and in the course of 24 hours, she changed her mind. And it is now gone.
And so now it's gone, but how it got there in the first instance, it was presumably in response to an outcry from the community about crime, right? I mean, is that it? Can you give the backstory of how you think this unit came to be in the first place? Because it's fairly new.
Sure, she set it up. I mean, there's no doubt about that. And she said she was hearing so often from people who they couldn't sleep at night from the amount of gunfire and things that are going on. There are a lot of guns in Memphis. I mean, there are a lot of guns in Memphis, and there are a lot of people dying. I think we had over 300 people murdered last year, and quote, that's an improvement.
So it's not a crime panic we're talking about. There is a real crime problem that people in the community are concerned about.
Yes. But the issue is, how are you going to go about it? And I don't care what you put in place. But the thing is that you have to be accountable. Okay. And so when you go back and then you look at these officers, they aren't really seriously veteran officers, right? And so then the question becomes, how are these officers picked? By whom? How are they trained? And what is the accountability? So far, at least I don't know, what is the record here? I mean, how many complaints have there been? From her side, I hear her saying that every complaint would have been addressed. But, I'm hearing from Mr. Crump and others that, people called up, they called internal affairs, particularly one guy that they talked about who said that these officers, and we don't know specifically if these officers, because there's 4 teams of them, put a gun to his head. He called internal affairs twice and he got no feedback, and so there has to be accountability for that. And even as I said the other day to another organization I was talking to, that we in the media have to take a look at ourselves too, and in terms of the role that we play in making sure that there is accountability. A lot of us, especially African-American newspapers, legacy papers, our resources are really, really meager. Like, we don't cover crime here as an everyday beat. There's more than one reason for that, but what we don't, but when I'm thinking about it now, I'm thinking, what, I might have to redeploy what I do have, just not so much to cover quote crime, but to cover accountability relative to the enforcement of crime.
And because it is a topic in the community, people are thinking. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead. It's not so much crime, but the law enforcement relative to crime.
You came to Memphis as a young reporter, just out of school in 1977, and adopted the city and as your own. It's got this rich Black history, both good, celebratory, and challenging. How much did you know about the city at the time, and what did you know about it then, and would you come to learn about it that made you love it so?
I knew 2 things about Memphis. I knew that Elvis Presley was from here because I used to watch all the Elvis Presley movies, and I knew that Dr. King died here. I got here because I went to the University of Missouri journalism school. I was in the bathroom one day. A professor came in and said, someone didn't show up for an interview at the commercial appeal. Would you go in and so that the school won't look bad? I said, well, what is that? Commercial appeal, because there's no name, there's no city to it. So he said it's Memphis, and okay, fine. So I went in. I did the interview for 15 minutes. I think for 13, he didn't ask me anything about journalism. He asked me about roots. Okay, and
Roots,
so at that time,
the mini series Roots. Yep, go ahead.
And at that time, I was taking 2 courses because I was finished with everything else. One was The Private Eye in America, and the other was Roots. So I could talk about it this way, that way, and the other. And so got through, and he said, well, we don't have a job. I said, well, that's fine. I'm just in here for the experience, and so the school won't look bad. 2 weeks later, he called me back and said, hey, we got a job. I said, nah, man, I got to interview with some others. We went through a long process, and that same guy in the bathroom convinced me that this would be a good place to start your career. And so I came to Memphis and just tried to make my way through at covering. Eventually, they started integrating the downtown beats. When I got there were only 2 other African American reporters at the daily newspaper, and I was the 3rd. And after a couple of years there, they decided they were going to start integrating the downtown beats. One of my friends was sent to the police department, the other to the federal beat, and I went to City Hall. So
making you one of the first Black people to cover City Hall in Memphis.
Yes, yes. And so I went through that, and then we were called in one day, and the editor who's now passed decided he was getting a lot of heat from the community about the lack of coverage relative to the African American community. And all the African American reporters, we had a few more at that time. We got together all the things we want to talk to him about. This obviously he had something in his mind, right? He wanted a specific reporter, like a quote minority affairs reporter, to focus in on the community. As I recall, I'm the only one in the room who argued against it, because I said, look, now that we've gotten to the point where we recognize we need to cover the community as a whole, we need to get into it. We don't need to. But it was obvious that he wanted to do one person. I went back, I thought about it, went back in. I told him I want that job. So he says, well, why would you want a job that you just argued for? And I said, because one, if you can make something out of it, I know I've got the skills to do that. And if it needs to die, I know I got the courage to tell you that too. And so for about 2.5 years, I just covered from the top to the bottom. And at that time, Ben Hooks was the head of the National NAACP. He was from Memphis. Yeah. I followed him and the different people around, and just I got affected, really, to be honest with you. I started to learn not so much about the community, but I started to learn about myself relative to the community, and then ran into a group here in Memphis that just really introduced me to another way of looking at slavery and how to look at myself relative to that. And I went through a process of self-discovery, made the transition from Leroy Williams Jr. to Karanja Ajanaku. And here I am.
And I asked you to recount all that because, you have deep knowledge of the city and the Black community's relationship to the city and place in it. And I just wonder if you could characterize, when a story like this happens, what is the community's relationship to power in civic life there? What in terms of feeling like it's a majority Black city, but does it feel like a majority Black city that has control over government, over power in the city?
Well, it is a majority African American community. There's no doubt about that. But it's a very, very poor community, right? And so we have African Americans throughout government. We have a city and a county mayor system. Both of the mayors are African American. The sheriff is African American. Most of the people on the city council are African American, and on the school board. But it's a very poor city, and from an economic standpoint, we are nowhere near where we need to be. And I know that if you don't have your economic base together, your politics is really just sort of window dressing in a way. And so that really, to me, in addition to what we've got to do from a social justice and criminal justice standpoint, we've got to get some economic justice going on, both in terms of any impediments from the outside, but also there has to be a mind shift inside about how we're going to go about marshaling our resources. It's one thing to say that we've got X number of people, but if you don't have a structure in place to be able to do something with those numbers, it doesn't work. It's like it just doesn't work. And so historically, that's been the challenge here. How are we going to take these numbers and marshal them in some kind of way that we can leverage, an economic opportunity? We've got this big not Saturn, but Ford operation coming in here with electric vehicles, and there's the promise of in West Tennessee. There's the promise of so many jobs and opportunities here, but we have to be structured, to be able to handle that. And that's really the challenge here.
Is money, indeed. Neva on YouTube asks, do the officers live in Memphis? And how people in the community are reacting to them as individuals. I hear her getting at we talk about all these system things, but these are 5 human beings who did this to another human being. And I just wonder about that.
Yes, they're all from either Memphis or the Memphis area. I haven't heard anything to say they're not from the from outside of Memphis. In fact, I think right now you should, that's where our officers come from. And so we don't really know as much about them as we need to now. And that's really the next frontier, from my standpoint, just digging into who these people are. And as I said earlier, where did they come from? How did they get hired, and what was involved in that? And then if you could really get into it, and really dig into their background, it's like, what in the world was it in their background that could cause one human being to work in concert with other human beings to treat another human being the way that they did on video? That's
knowing that they were being videoed, knowing that.
And so when you listen to the video, the videos and the footage, you can hear that them almost, and I don't even say almost, it sounds like they're concocting a story. They knew that it was on. At one point, one of them says, "Yeah, did you see him go for my gun?" Well, no, I don't see anything. I see you talking about that, that kind of a thing. So who are these people? But as I said, I was telling somebody the other day, as bad as these actors are, and they gotta own up. They gotta own up for that. But they have families too, and they have children. And so we gotta find a way to, how do I say it? Be holistic in the healing process, relative to that. And that ain't no easy thing.
Yeah. Karanja Ajanaku is editor of the new Tri-State Defender in Memphis. Check them out to follow this ongoing story. And thank you so much for spending this time with us.
My pleasure, Kai. Thank you.
Coming up, Memphis is sadly not the only city reeling from violence right now. The residents of Monterey Park, California, are still processing the mass shooting that occurred there on the eve of Lunar New Year. But this majority Asian American community has a rich history and story that is much more than tragedy. That's next.
It's Notes from America. I'm Kai Wright.
We are just a few weeks into the new year, and we can't escape one maddeningly stubborn problem.
The deadly toll of gun violence is again our top story tonight.
Another mass shooting claiming lives in California.
11 people were killed in Monterey Park, California.
Well, sadly, we are turning now to another shooting. This one at a nightclub.
Word of another mass shooting in California. This one in Half Moon Bay.
There have already been at least 39 mass shootings this year. That's according to the Gun Violence Archive. One of them has struck a particularly emotional nerve because of the circumstances. It happened in Monterey Park, California, a predominantly Asian American suburb, at a dance hall on the eve of Lunar New Year. Both the gunman and his victims were of Chinese descent, and we don't know his motives, but the attack nonetheless sent shockwaves through Asian American communities around the country where people just frankly have already been on edge for a few years. To learn more about Monterey Park and its history, we called up a scholar who grew up nearby. James Zarsadiaz is a professor of history at the University of San Francisco, and he's the author of the book Resisting Change in Suburbia, Asian Immigrants and Frontier Nostalgia in LA. And James, thanks for making time for us.
Thanks for having me.
So you published an op-ed in the LA Times in response to the shooting in Monterey Park, and I really was moved by the way you opened the column. You wrote, "For thousands of fellow Asian Americans, Monterey Park is our home, even if we don't live there." Just to start us off, what do you mean by that?
For me, for a lot of Asian Americans, what happened in Monterey Park was really triggering and painful. And we're still obviously working through all of this and processing things. But because, again, of the familiarity of the landscape, Monterey Park really embodies how a lot of Asian Americans live today, with single-family homes in suburbs. But there's a bit of a, twist to that dimension in the sense that these strip malls are not necessarily mom and pop shops owned by white families or rows and rows of mainstream American chains. But in this case, places like Monterey Park are dim sum restaurants, boba shops by the dozens, Buddhist temples, along with Christian churches. And that space of where the crime happened and the violence occurred is especially, familiar to children of immigrants whose parents and elders go to places like dance halls and social gatherings like that.
Let me ask you about that.
Yeah.
Because honestly, I have to say, I am one of the people who I learned about Monterey Park as this majority Asian American community through this horrible news. And I detest that's how I came to this, to this place. And one of the odd moments of, I don't know if the right word is joy, but that I get when I was reading about it is the vision of these dance halls. And can you say a word or two just to help us place this in joy? A word or two about the role these dance halls play in a Lunar New Year?
Absolutely. And I think, this is why, what happened is so personal and resonates with a lot of Asian Americans is these dance halls are places of joy, as you said. They're places, where revelers come together, right? And in this case, it was because it was Lunar New Year, it was especially, boisterous and fun and presumably loud and exciting. But even apart from the Lunar New Year weekend, these dance halls are spaces of gathering community. My own mother goes to places like this where she meets up with a bunch of her friends around her generation, and a lot of them are retirees or people who, are empty nesters, and they just want to have time with their friends and their loved ones, and they go to these dance halls where all kinds of music are played. Sometimes these dance halls are more ethnic specific, so it caters to Chinese, it caters to a lot of Korean or Filipino immigrants or Filipino Americans or Asian Americans, broadly speaking, right? But oftentimes these spaces are, the predominant community are immigrants, right? And refugees, and oftentimes multi-generational. So that's why, when we think of these dance halls, they are places of joy. They are places of excitement and caring and and love and all of these things. And I think that's why it especially hurts, right? What we heard about Monterey Park.
Monterey Park has been called an ethnoburb. That's a term a lot of us are learning for the first time as a consequence of this awful news story. So what is an ethnoburb?
Ethnoburb is basically a suburb that has a large concentration of a specific ethnic or racial group. And that can be measured in a variety of ways. Oftentimes it's just population size, right? Do you have a plurality, a majority of typically non-white groups? And so Monterey Park is in many ways the OG, the original ethnoburb, because it reached an Asian majority by the early 1990s. And scholars, researchers, pundits, and even many residents themselves consider Monterey Park the original ethnoburb, the first suburban Chinatown. And what happened in Monterey Park was a large concentration of particularly Chinese from Hong Kong and Taiwan settling in during the late 70s, but really in the 1980s. And from there, you start to see this kind of mushrooming of, if you will, of Asian American communities surrounding Monterey Park. It'll extend to Alhambra, it'll extend to San Gabriel, Rosemead, Temple City on the west side of the San Gabriel Valley. And it would pretty much jump eastward to more outer ring suburbs of LA.
And so as that migration began in the 70s and 80s into those ethnoburbs, who exactly are we talking about? I mean, was there a class question here amongst Asian Americans that might reflect the change in who immigrated into the U.S. before and after the 1965 Immigration Reform Act, which, opened the door to more people from Asian countries?
Well, in the 1980s, a lot of the Asian residents who moved into Monterey Park were largely from Hong Kong and Taiwan. Many of them were middle class or affluent, and they landed what is often called white-collar jobs, right? In business, the medical field, engineering, and so forth. The class difference is stark compared to their pre-1965 counterparts, who many of them were oftentimes agricultural workers, working in the service industry. And so Monterey Park quickly garnered a reputation as, the place you want to be if you are an Asian immigrant of a certain class background with certain means. As the 1980s and 1990s carried on, there were other suburbs surrounding Monterey Park that became more fashionable. These were, by the way, suburbs that for many years were majority white, and many of them quite well-to-do, right? And seen as rich communities for even white Americans. So the incomes and, if you will, privileges that came with higher incomes allowed them to enter spaces that were otherwise not open to them a couple decades prior.
How were they received?
With resistance, oftentimes. Some residents were open to having Asian immigrants so long as they assimilated or attempted to assimilate or demonstrate gestures towards assimilation. So, in other words, for example, not speaking Chinese in public. And the imposition is largely not necessarily just the cultural aspects, but also, again, because of the aesthetic. There were, again, now more Chinese supermarkets and businesses, Chinese signage that was not understood by non-Chinese speakers. It became a battle zone, and temperatures eventually cooled down, and residents reached accord in some ways. But there were definitely a lot of moments of hostility and also a lot of moments of learning and a genuine interest in trying to understand each other.
As I gather, the folks who were moving to the neighborhood were moving as home buyers. And I wonder what were they seeking in that regard? Like, as home buyers moving to these places, what is it they were looking for, you think?
It sounds very romanticized and cliche, but they're searching for the suburban American dream. And that suburban American dream includes a single family home. It includes a nice car. It includes a stable career. It includes family life and all of the trappings of suburbia. And not just live there, but own there. And really, again, creating this idea that they have established themselves in a country that for a lot of people is the promised land.
And let me ask you a tough question here, too, because when we talk about the suburbs and the movement to the suburbs, it's impossible for me not to think about white flight in general and all of its versions. And I just wonder, like, how much of what you're describing was also white flight amongst a certain class of Asian Americans from the inner city communities that were largely Black, Mexican, and lower income Asian American. Is that a fair comparison? Does that even apply here?
Yeah, there are a couple of ways I want to respond to that. The first thing is that, and this is going back to a question about class, and so the earlier pre-1965 generation oftentimes relied on the urban enclave of Chinatown or historic Filipino town or, other neighborhoods across the United States because they didn't have the income and means to suburbanize, right? That's also coupled with the fact that before the civil rights movement, they couldn't even fathom or think about or even dream about the possibility of moving to the suburbs, right? The other aspect that I want us to consider is that, yes, white folks also left these suburbs with the increase of non-white residents, particularly immigrants, particularly Asians. For some, it was out of prejudice. But for some, it was, for them, at least in their eyes, they believed that the amount of change that occurred and quite rapidly was too much for them to take. And it's not necessarily to apologize or condone their behavior and their decisions to leave, but it's a way of trying to understand why they felt that that amount of change was too hard to wrap their heads around. And again, one can easily infer from that is racial, right? And in some cases, in many ways, yes, it was. But for some of them, it was more like there's a type of suburban landscape I'm used to that I'm not feeling anymore, and I need to go somewhere else to find that, right?
It's interesting because the whole idea of the suburbs, one of the ideas of suburbs is I'm not here to be challenged.
Right, exactly.
This is comfortable, and now you're challenging me with this diversity stuff.
Right,
and that's not what I signed up for.
Right, and a lot of it too, right? And the range of reactions was anywhere between wanting to include Asian Americans in particular, or on the other extreme, vilifying them. But a lot of people were somewhere in the middle, right? Caught in this moral dilemma. And in the context of the 80s and 90s, there was, again, for a lot of Americans, including white Americans, an openness or at least a willingness to see what this multiracial American could look like. And it's that moment in the 80s, 90s, and 2000s where a lot of these suburbs became battlegrounds around race and racial inclusion and change and diversity.
We, of course, have since the Monterey Park shooting had yet another mass shooting in Half Moon Bay in Northern California, also involving a shooter of Chinese descent. In this case, the victims are not also Asian American, but I just taken together these stories. I wonder about the emotional toll in general on the Asian American community, particularly the Chinese American community, given all that we've heard over the last few years about people who just feel newly uncertain and unsafe in their communities.
Absolutely. These two tragedies back to back during and around Lunar New Year, it's tough to process. And a lot of folks, myself included, who identify as Asian American are still going through the motions. Why this has been disturbing, why what's occurred over the last few days has been disturbing is because for a lot of Asian Americans since 2020, news of violence towards the Asian American community has become commonplace. And that's not to say it was never there prior to 2020, but the volume, the frequency is why a lot of us feel constant grief, trauma, and fear. When we read those headlines and get the news alerts, we often assume that the perpetrator or perpetrators were doing this as an act of anti-Asian violence, right? In these two cases, we don't know the motives. That's still being investigated. Both perpetrators are of Asian descent. And that's where the story gets a little tricky. I think that's partly why in these two examples, specifically with Monterey Park and Half Moon Bay, Asian Americans especially are like, what is happening here? And that's a broader conversation too to have around the debates around gun control, but also mental health. I can go down that road on and within the community with Asian Americans and how we address mental health. So that's why I think a lot of us are still trying to make sense of, why these perpetrators did what they did, but also what does it mean when the perpetrator is quote unquote one of their own?
There is a real conversation in many communities of color about how we handle our mental health and all of the strain. What do you think about the role of mental health in the community in general? Not necessarily applying it to these shootings, but just how that has come up for you in the last couple of weeks.
This has come up more anecdotally and more just kind of casually amongst family and friends who've been, we've been talking about what's occurred. And for a lot of Asian Americans, particularly immigrants and refugees, not wanting to address, maybe not confronting, or maybe minimizing trauma and grief. And anything in that universe of feelings. And because of that onslaught, there's questions of how do I manage this? Where do I go? Can I go somewhere? Should I go somewhere? What do people think about seeking out mental health resources and support? I can go on. And I know that a lot of communities of color struggle with that question as well. But the broader feeling is for a lot of Asian Americans, we want to find some joy. We want to find some relief. And we also need to have a more frank discussion across racial lines about caring for our communities and thinking through about how we grapple with trauma, including ones that were racially motivated, but also ones that weren't, right? So this is just a way to think through. I want us to kind of think through, where do we go from here? For Asian Americans, we're sorting that out. And right now, it's just a matter of trying to process all of these examples of terrible and tragic news during what is otherwise supposed to be a happy, joyous time. And I think that's especially why it's been painful and a grueling process.
Indeed. James Zarsadiaz is a professor of history at the University of San Francisco and author of Resisting Change in Suburbia, Asian Immigrants and Frontier Nostalgia in LA. Thank you so much for this, James.
Thank you so much.
Notes from America is a production of WNYC Studios. You can follow us wherever you get your podcasts and on Instagram at Notes with Kai. Music and mixing by Jared Paul. Matthew Mirando is our live engineer. Reporting, producing, and editing by Karen Frillman, Vanessa Handy, Regina DeHeer, Rahima Nassa, Kushat Navadar, and Lindsay Foster Thomas. And a special welcome to our brand new executive producer, Andre Robert Lee. I'm Kai Wright. Thanks for spending this time with us.